Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Taste for Treason, The Letter That Smashed a Nazi Spy Ring, by Andrew Jeffrey, narrated by Jake Ruddle. The greatest peacetime spy ring in history. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Go ahead, investigate the cocksuckers. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull to J. Edgar Hoover. There is no doubt whatever that Jordan is a member of the German espionage organization at Hamburg. MI5, January 1938. Intercept has created a tremendous impression in the 12e Bureau and French naval circles. MI5, October 1938. Movie exposes work of Hitler stooges in U.S. Chicago Tribune on Confessions of a Nazi Spy, May 1939. Preface. A Taste for Treason. Toulon Naval Arsenal, France, 6th of March, 1939. They came for him in the still, silent hour before dawn. Capitaine de Vasseur Puech woke the young officer and said, "Aubert, votre recours en grâce est rejeté. Habillez-vous. C'est l'heure de la pénitence." Aubert, your appeal for mercy has been rejected. Get dressed. It is time for repentance. Ensign Mark Aubert had spent the 7 weeks since his court-martial refusing to wash or shave and shouting rambling confessions at the drab, indifferent walls of his cell. It had been the madness of the condemned. But the new day would bring atonement, and, resigned to his fate, he heard Mass, gave Naval Chaplain l'Abbé Fabre a last letter for his mother, and waited, chain-smoking, until the escort arrived. Normally a hive of activity even at that early hour, Toulon Naval Dockyard was eerily quiet that fine spring morning. Gendarmes patrolled the streets to keep the morbidly curious away, while, beneath the walls of Fort Malbousquet, 700 soldiers and marines had formed up, in silent, serried ranks, around a wooden post backed by a bank of earth. A truck drew up, and Aubert was escorted toward the post. He stopped briefly to embrace the priest, then waited patiently while an officer read the sentence of the court-martial. La peine de mort par fusillade. The penalty of death by shooting. The German military intelligence service Abwehr's top spy in France for more than a year, Aubert's treachery had gone undetected until an American Nazi agent's letter, intercepted in Scotland, triggered an international spy hunt. Among those identified by MI5 and FBI investigators was a German widow living in Dublin, Eire, and an intercept on her mail revealed that she was in contact with another Nazi spy, codenamed Charles, apparently a French naval officer. Identifying Charles from among thousands of Marine Nationale officers was not going to be easy, yet the rapidly mounting international tension in the summer of 1938 lent the search immense urgency. The Japanese had marched into the nationalist Chinese capital Nanjing in December 1937 and massacred perhaps as many as 200,000 Chinese civilians in 6 weeks. As the rest of the world looked on, unable or unwilling to intervene, more than 20,000 women and girls were brutally gang-raped. Pregnant women had fetuses torn from their bodies, and babies were skewered on swords. To place the depraved rape of Nanjing in perspective, British civilian deaths for the entire 6 years of the Second World War totaled 67,000, a third of the Chinese civilian death toll at Nanjing. And in an alarming portent of what was to come, British and American river gunboats evacuating Western civilians were deliberately targeted by marauding Japanese aircraft. One, USS Panay, was sunk. In Africa, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had unleashed 100,000 troops and deadly clouds of chemical weapons on defenseless Ethiopia. Here, as in Nanjing, Thousands of women were raped, hospitals were bombed, and in one 3-day killing spree following an attempt on the life of an Italian general, around 6,000 Ethiopian men, women, and children were shot, bayoneted, or burned alive. In all, some 275,000 Ethiopians died as Mussolini pursued his ridiculous quest for a latter-day Roman Empire. The rest of the world, indifferent to the fate of a few thousand black Africans, paid no heed as deposed Ethiopian ruler Haile Selassie warned, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." As if to bear out Haile Selassie's grim prediction, a deadly miasma of ferocious small wars was already spreading across Europe. The Spanish Civil War was plumbing new depths of bestial savagery, as the militarist right and hitherto pacifist left from around the world wade into a bloody proxy war that would cost more than 500,000 lives before the fascists, ably assisted by Nazi Germany, claimed victory in 1939. Britain and France contented themselves with pointless moralizing from the sidelines, then professed weary surprise when it transpired that nobody was listening. Taking his cue from the feeble international response to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, Hitler had reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936 and annexed Austria in 1938. 6 months later, in a rabble-rousing tirade at a Nazi rally, he demanded that Czechoslovakia evacuate the disputed Sudetenland border region within days or face invasion. Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe units were heading for the Czechoslovak border, German terrorists were murdering Czechoslovak policemen, the Red Army was massing on Poland's eastern border, the French, Romanians, Yugoslavs, and Hungarians were all mobilizing, Italy had ordered all Jews out of the country, and air raid drills were being rehearsed in London and Paris. It was abundantly clear to all but the most willfully myopic that Hitler was an amoral, racist thug at the head of a militarist cult hell-bent on, at the very least, continental domination. Yet, having colluded in the destruction of Czechoslovakia at Munich in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain boasted, albeit while accelerating British rearmament, of peace for our time. French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, a more astute judge of Hitler's character than Chamberlain, entertained no such conceit, and returned to Paris wretched at having danced to the British appeasement tune. "Don't have any illusions," he said. "This is only a respite, and if we don't make use of it, we will all be shot." As Daladier recognized, Hitler was unappeasable, and Munich had merely delayed the inevitable. This was the fraught background against which the hunt for the French naval officer spy Charles began. And it was a search that assumed even greater urgency when the British intercept on the Dublin agent's mail revealed that Charles was handing his delighted Abwehr spymasters a treasure trove of French naval ciphers, blueprints, and technical reports. Anglo-French strategy for a sea war against Germany and Italy was being comprehensively betrayed, and the vital Mediterranean route to Suez and the Middle East oil fields was in jeopardy. Even the mobilization orders issued to the French Mediterranean fleet during the September 1938 Munich crisis were in German hands, decrypted almost as soon as they reached their intended recipients. By then, however, the MI5 intercept had yielded the vital clue that would lead the Deuxième Bureau to Ensign de Vaisseau Marc Aubert. Caught in the act of copying yet more documents for his Abwehr spymasters when he was arrested aboard the destroyer Vauquelin, Aubert was tried by court-martial in January 1939. The proceedings were largely held in camera, but the left-leaning press saw enough of the accused to draw unfavorable comparisons between his treachery and endemic French government corruption. Others on the right were unequivocal in their condemnation. L'Ouest éclair, thundering that he was un des plus abominables criminels qui ait soilé l'uniforme d'officier français, one of the worst criminals ever to soil the uniform of a French officer. He had, suggested one observer, acquired un goût pour la trahison, a taste for treason. 2 months later, on that March morning in Toulon, Aubert got to his knees and was tied to the post, his only show of emotion an emphatic shake of his head when a sailor stepped forward with a blindfold. But this was a judicial killing, up close and personal, and staring into the pleading eyes of a condemned man could easily upset even the most cold-blooded marksman's aim, so it was applied anyway. Quietly reminding his men to aim for the heart, the officer in charge glanced at his watch, raised his sword, and, at precisely 6 a.m., brought it smartly down again. 12 bullets, each preceded by a shockwave 30 times its own volume, slammed into Aubert at close to 2,000 feet per second. Soft tissue turned instantly to boiling jelly, and vital organs were shredded before the volley burst out of his back in a spray of blood, flesh, and splintered bone, to kick up puffs of dirt in the earth bank behind him. As startled birds scattered noisily into the still morning air, a sailor stepped forward and blew the young officer's brains out with an automatic pistol. One of France's most damaging traitors was dead, and the whole gruesome ritual had taken less than 4 minutes. At the very moment German spy Aubert faced one firing squad in Toulon, British spy and former Italian naval officer Antonio Scarpa was being tied to a chair with his back towards another in an army base near Rome. Part of a network run by Tom Kendrick, the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, head of station in Vienna, Scarpa had been spying on Italian naval rearmament and meddling in the Spanish Civil War. But Kendrick's wafer-thin cover as passport control officer fooled nobody, and his networks were rounded up in August 1938, a few weeks after the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria. Kendrick, his wife, and his driver were bundled out of Vienna in a blaze of publicity, and 4 other members of the British spy ring received long prison sentences. For Scarpa, however, there could only be one outcome, and the timing of his execution to coincide with Aubert's was no accident. Yet another firing squad assembled a few days later at a rifle range near Nancy in northwestern France to shoot 26-year-old gardener Helmut Gruneberg, an Abwehr spy caught snooping around the Maginot Line, France's supposedly impregnable barrier against a German invasion. 3 weeks later, Georg Frock and Matthias Glaser were dragged to the death house in Berlin's Plötzensee prison and guillotined for spying for France. Many others would make that grim journey during that last summer of peace, though not naval architect and British spy Dr. Karl Kruger. Betrayed by Volkert van Kuetrik, a Dutch double agent employed by MI6 who had sold out to Nazis, Kruger is believed to have cheated the Plötzensee headsman by hanging himself in his cell. In Britain, Abwehr agent Elsie Duncombe had committed suicide. 4 others were serving lengthy jail terms, and yet more were under MI5 surveillance. Spies were also being unmasked in Panama, Czechoslovakia, Turkey, and France, among them Paris beautician Lucienne Garnier, whose body would be discovered in the Seine in February 1940. She had been strangled by her officer husband after he discovered that she was peddling military secrets to the Japanese. It was a dangerous, often fatal time to be a spy. Today, the place where Marc Aubert faced his executioners lies in the shadow of an autoroute flyover, the roadside ditch where his shattered body lay, now covered by a neat pavement. It is an unremarkable spot. Yet what took place there on that spring morning in 1939 was the culmination of a 7-year duel between Abwehr's spies and the British, American, Canadian, French, Belgian, Czech, and Irish security services. It was a duel shot through with all the spy fiction staples of alluring femme fatales, Nazi thugs, sinister spy masters, glamorous film stars, and seedy traitors. For the Austrian playboy cavorting with a Côte d'Azur nightclub dancer in a champagne bath, the Swiss Mata Hari seducing French naval officers, the German lawyer spying on British airfields with his teenage mistress, and the Belgian electrician whose well-paid treachery would precipitate the 1940 Dunkirk evacuation, espionage had its compensations. For others, among them the French beauty queen driven to suicide on a Moroccan beach, the Berlin society hostess ritually beheaded with an axe, and the Hollywood moguls forced to brave pro-Nazi intimidation, spying would prove anything but amusing. Europe might have been awash with spies of all hues, but most European nations had long since developed security services like Britain's MI5 and the French Sûreté Nationale to counter the threat. In the United States, there was no shortage of evidence that Nazis and their American fellow travelers were bent on political subversion. Yet, until 1936, there was no U.S. government body charged with counter-espionage, and most Americans still clung to the naive view that spies were a uniquely European problem. That was until Nazi espionage plots in the United States and Britain converged with the interception in a Scottish post office of a letter detailing a plan by Abwehr spies to forcibly relieve a U.S. Army officer of secret plans for the defense of America's East Coast. In the months that followed, a joint British and American counterintelligence operation would unmask yet more Nazi agents in the United States, Britain, Canada, Ireland, Panama, Czechoslovakia, and France. Told in full for the first time, this is the story of that operation, and the breaking of what FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, albeit never one for self-effacing understatement, would describe as the greatest peacetime spy ring of all time. Yet that letter, intercepted in Scotland, did much more than unmask Nazi spies across Europe and North America. It led directly to the formation of an intelligence and security alliance of unequaled power and reach, an alliance that hastened Allied victory in the Second World War, that held the line in the Cold War, and, for better or worse, still underpins Anglo-American relations in the 21st century. Quite simply, that letter helped shape the modern world. Chapter 1. The Mad Major. Herzlich willkommen an Arsch der Welt. A warm welcome to the arsehole of the world. Sign at a secret German training airfield, Russia, 1922. Tower Bridge, London, 30th of September, 1931. At first, the silver wings of the little de Havilland puss moth were all but invisible against a leaden grey sky. Then it swooped down, lined up on the twin Gothic towers of Tower Bridge, and shot through the gap between the roadway and the iron tracery of the walkway above. As astonished motorists and passers-by looked on, it continued upriver, passing low over the next 7 bridges, before darting through the central arch of Westminster Bridge and climbing away towards Brooklands Aerodrome. Daredevil pilot, wartime fighter ace, and resting actor Major Christopher Draper told reporters on landing that the flight had been a publicity stunt, partly to get work for himself, and partly to highlight the plight of other jobless ex-servicemen reduced to penury by the global recession. The dramatic one-man protest led to an appearance in court charged with dangerous flying and flying without a valid pilot's license. A policeman claimed that the puss moth had dropped to within 7 feet of the Tower Bridge roadway, and the Draper and his cameraman passenger narrowly escaped death as the bridge was about to be raised to allow a ship to pass through. This was nonsense, as Paramount News footage of the flight showed, and Draper was let off with a stern warning. But it was music to the ears of a resting actor dubbed the Mad Major by a delighted press, as it brought welcome offers of work, including a starring role in Aces of the Air, a nationwide tour by wartime British and German airmen delivering homilies on peace and the future of aviation to cinema audiences about to be thrilled by Howard Hughes' new aviation comedy, Sky Devils. In the audience, when Aces of the Air opened at London's Plaza Cinema on the 24th of June 1932, was the tour's promoter, Colonel William Francis Forbes Sempill. A scion of one of Scotland's oldest aristocratic dynasties and a wartime Royal Naval Air Service veteran, the master of Sempill had been spying for the Imperial Japanese Navy since leading a naval aviation mission to Tokyo in 1922. Seduced by the militarist fascism of the ultra-nationalist Kodoha, Way of the Emperor faction, and motivated to treason by an eye-watering bank overdraft, this clever, pushy, egocentric aristocrat was a keen supporter of British fascist organizations like the stridently anti-Semitic National Political League and the Royal Empire Society, a peculiar group that advocated stemming the tide of imperial decline with a program of planned emigration that would increase the Anglo-Saxon gene pool in fractious colonies. Sempill was also, in 1931, one of the founding principals behind the Anglo-German Fellowship, an organization so rabidly right-wing that Soviet mole Kim Philby joined as effective cover for his own brand of treachery. Sempill had begun planning the Aces of the Air tour after one of his regular visits to Germany, and his shrill advance publicity trumpeted personal appearances by 4 famous air aces. This was certainly warranted in the case of German Eduard Ritter von Schleich, the wartime Black Knight, who had a pour le mérite, or Blue Max, and 35 victories to his credit. Mad Major Christopher Draper, fresh from his London Bridges flight, had 9 victories, so he too could be considered an ace. But Sempill was lying when he tried to pass off Army officer Gunther von Richthofen as a brother of the late Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, and an illustrious airman in his own right. Gunther von Richthofen was really only a distant cousin of the Red Baron, and no airman. The other British ace, Major Alan Bridgman, was actually just a shy and unremarkable wartime pilot down on his luck after a messy divorce. It is telling that this was to be a purely Anglo-German affair. No airmen from Britain's wartime allies, or from Germany's for that matter, were invited. Aces of the Air ran for 151 packed performances, with the charismatic Teddy von Schleich, his black uniform aglow with medals, the star turn. A fierce anti-communist who had narrowly escaped death while resisting an attempted Bolshevik coup in Bavaria, von Schleich had been among the first recruits to the nascent Nazi Party. And, as Christopher Draper writes, "From him I learned a great deal about the National Socialist Party, and we had long and most interesting discussions, especially because one of our party, who accompanied the tour as a sort of business manager, was a very English Jew. As can be imagined, he and Teddy had the most heated arguments. Teddy used to tell me time and again, 'Christoph, it is only a question of time before my Hitler is the power.'" Draper subsequently went to Germany as von Schleich's guest, and on the 15th of October 1932 was introduced to Hitler at Munich airport. The Führer seemed bored at first, but brightened on being told by his press agent Ernst Hanfstaengl that Major Draper would be making a case for the Nazis in influential circles in London. Quite where Putzi Hanfstaengl got the idea that a cash-strapped, unemployed actor could wield pro-Nazi influence in Britain's corridors of power is unclear. Perhaps Draper's association with Sempill had something to do with it, and, while this may only be a coincidence, Sempill had visited Germany just a week before Draper arrived in Munich. Whatever really happened in Germany, Draper was by no means the first gay man to find the Nazis' pantomime rituals and homoerotic male bonding strangely appealing. And on the 19th of March, 1933, the Sunday Dispatch reported that Major Christopher Draper, recently returned from Munich where he had met Herr Hitler, was organizing a nationwide series of talks on behalf of the Nazis. At the end of April, an MI5 mail intercept on Dr. Hans Thost, the London correspondent of the Nazi Party newspaper Volkischer Beobachter, and a known low-level German spy, turned up an invitation to a meeting in Hampstead at which Draper would speak on the future of fascism in Europe. Thost recruited Draper as a Nazi agent. That much is clear. But the two men offer radically different accounts of how they met and the circumstances surrounding Draper's recruitment. Thost's version is that in 1932, towards the end of the Aces of the Air tour, he took Draper and von Schleck to lunch at London's fashionable Odenino's restaurant and encouraged the Englishman to write pro-Nazi letters to the press. About a year later, Draper told Thost that he was prepared to work on behalf of Germany, that he was very short of money, and that he would like to assist the German Luftwaffe. Thost replied that Draper would first have to meet intelligence officers in Hamburg, and after some haggling over who should pay the fare, Draper agreed to go. Draper's autobiography, The Mad Major, published in 1962, makes no mention of the lunch at Odenino's, and claims that Thost invited him to his Wimbledon home on several occasions in 1933, and, after one particularly boozy lunch, proposed that he should become a German spy. Draper says that he asked for a couple of days to think it over, as he was anxious to get in touch with MI5 as quickly as possible, for I realized that here was the most wonderful opportunity to double-cross the Hun. He maintains that he told an acquaintance, one Baron K. de Triop, of the approach, and 2 days later met a Major X and Sir Percy Sillitoe, the head of MI5, who instructed him to go along with everything the Germans asked of him, but to keep MI5 informed of his every move. Draper then says that he boarded a Lufthansa flight from Croydon to Hamburg on Sunday, 23rd of July 1933, and on landing was taken to the Atlantic Hotel and left to his own devices for the evening. A young German called for him the next morning and led him to a cafe, where, in a scene that might have come straight out of one of his own low-budget movies, the only customer was a pasty-faced man seated at a corner table with a light behind him, wearing dark glasses and a hat pulled low over his eyes. Coffee was served, and the spy master, who gave his name as Degenhardt, said he wanted intelligence on military aircraft, aircraft factories, and RAF squadrons. Draper replied that he could get this information, and, perhaps a little over-eagerly, asked how much he would be paid. The German replied that payment would be by results, and gave Draper 2 mail relay addresses, one in Hamburg and the other in Rotterdam, through which he was to send intelligence. Letters to Draper, ostensibly about stamp collecting, would be couriered to Britain and posted there. The meeting over, Draper returned to the Atlantic, packed, and left for home. That, at least, was Draper's version of events. Yet neither Draper nor Thost was telling the whole truth. Thost's account was given to Allied interrogators 11 years later, in 1945, so he can be forgiven some confusion over dates. It was also by then in his interest to downplay his role as an influencer and talent spotter. But Draper's story that he contacted MI5 immediately Thost tried to recruit him, and that the Hamburg trip was undertaken with their sanction, is nonsense. MI5 records show that they were already aware of Draper's links to Thost, but that his first meeting with MI5 actually took place on the 3rd of August 1933, a week after his return from Germany. Draper made no mention of a cafe, dark glasses, or a hat during the interview, merely stating that Degenhardt had been a German,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?